Hello and welcome to Books Up Close, the podcast. I'm Chris Lloyd. This is the close reading show for writers, readers and language nerds. In today's festive Christmas special, I talked to Professor Holly Furneaux about Charles Dickens' 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol. Holly teaches and researches Victorian literature and culture at Cardiff University. Her work focuses on the cultural history of war, gender, the history of sexuality and the history of emotions. Following her first book, Queer Dickens, she has continued her fascination with him. She was advisor on the BBC series Dickensian and an organiser of the annual Dickens Day for over a decade. Welcome, Holly. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be enjoyable. Deep dive into Dickens.
Yeah, I was like, we need to do a Christmas episode of the podcast. Just did a Halloween episode and we talked about Dracula. That was really fun. So I was like, we've got to do a Christmas episode. And I was like, well, we have to therefore talk about A Christmas Carol. And I was like, who do I know? Who is the Dickens person I know? And it was you. Yours was the name that came into my head. So I'm excited to dig into this book, which I guess a lot of people will know in some format, whether they've read it or whether they've seen adaptations. So it's kind of interesting to go back to the text and see what comes up.
Yeah, everyone will have their favourite adaptation, I think. Usually adapted, isn't it? Muppets Christmas Carol is always our Christmas ritual.
Yeah.
So it is interesting to go back to the text because those recreations are so vivid that you're thinking of those. And looking at this very opening of A Christmas Carol, it's a bit that we don't really see adapted that much.
Yeah. And I think the Muppets one is probably the one that they lift the most direct text from, right? Because they actually have like the narration. So I was like, oh, that line is in the book actually.
Yes.
Which is always enjoyable to watch.
More of gravy than of the grave.
Yeah. Fantastic line. Before we get into that, I want to know generally, how do you feel about close reading? Obviously, you teach literature for a living, so I imagine this is your bread and butter, but how do you feel about it as a practice?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of gift to the reader to feel like you're in a collaboration with the author, because obviously each of us brings our own things to a close reading. None of us is a blank slate. So I open up A Christmas Carol and the things I bring to it will be different to the things you or each of us brings. So we're reading with all our set of preconceptions. So then we're in a kind of collaboration, correspondence, dialogue with the author. So I think of it as a kind of conversation between me and Dickens when I'm reading this. But I also think close reading can be a very powerful tool for reassessment, that it allows us to go back and unpick things that we've always believed, because certain narratives about certain authors, particularly Dickens, he's got a particular cultural status that means a whole set of ideas attached to him. But if you go back and close read the materials, you've got an opportunity to unpick that and form your own view and then support it with evidence. And as literary scholars, or for all readers, it is our power tool, isn't it? That we can then say, actually, I've got a different opinion of this because I've gone back and read this closely. And here's my evidence for why I think we should read this differently to how perhaps we were taught to read Dickens at school, or how culture tells us to expect what we're told to expect about Dickens. So I think close reading is essential, really, for us to be able to form our own view and take confidence that our reading is legitimate. We've got grounds for why we read it in this way.
Yeah, the evidence is interesting. And there's a few bits of this opening to A Christmas Carol that, in terms of narrative voice, that I want us to talk about. And I think you might have more to say on that. That, again, might not be the idea we have in our head of what a Dickens novel is, or the kind of the tone and the voice of this opening is really kind of striking in a number of ways. So I'm really excited to get into it. Okay, I'm going to read the opening for a change. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnised it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night, in an easterly wind, upon his own ramparts, than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. That opening line is great though, right? Like this is a starting of a text like Marley was dead, to begin with. And
Hmm.
it is so evocative in so many ways. Marley was dead, and we're like, well, we don't know who Marley is, but whatever, we're going with it. To begin with. And I always feel like that to begin with is like double, right? It's like, here's the start of the story, right? I'm telling you this is the beginning, but also he's not going to be dead for very long. Like he's setting up like to begin with, Marley was dead. Let's get the kind of groundwork done. But he's already in kind of foreshadowing mode. He's already like telegraphing the entire novel in like one sentence.
Yeah, yeah, this and then moving through the whole passage, this insistence that the reader has to go with the narrator.
Yeah,
There is no doubt whatever about that sentence too.
yeah,
And then this constant like reiterating old Marley was as dead as a doornail, another great
yeah.
image that's coming right at the end of that first paragraph. So, like, a sense that the reader has to be cajoled, persuaded to go along with this gambit that the narrator explicitly tells us a number of times this isn't going to work unless you accept what I'm telling you. It's quite an interesting thing about kind of setting up a contract
Mm,
between the author and the reader that we're asking, I suppose, the reader to place their faith and trust in this narrator in order to set us up for those things that are going to stretch our belief, especially if we come to this thinking, oh, we're going to have a realist author.
mm.
Like, how is that going to work that we've got a character who is only dead to begin with? And yeah, Dickens taking that plunge into the Gothic that he really needs us to be willing to go with him.
Yeah, which is so funny because I think we're used to the Gothic. It's all kind of mood, it's atmosphere, it's kind of the build up. Whereas here he's like, no, I just need to tell you, like this is what this is, and you just need to be okay with it. So just get on board, people. It's kind of funny. It's like quite wry as an opening. That I don't think
Yeah.
everyone reads Dickens as funny always.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of silly humor here,
Mm,
isn't there? Like the coming up in the second paragraph. I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail.
yeah.
I might have inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. Like, what a great comic phrasing.
Yeah.
Coffin nail is the deadest piece of ironmongery. It's quite silly, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's slightly sort of slapstick humor and very much sort of Dickens showing the kind of clunking of the string,
Mm,
the puppeteer, what we'd now maybe describe as metafiction, where the author explicitly uncovers their craft and says, "Oh, look," and that even like, "Oh, I've chosen this simile because that's the one we all agree on. The wisdoms of our ancestors is in the simile."
mm,
Um, my hands shall not disturb it. So, like a quite a crafty version, crafty and crafted. Like, oh look, I'm the author with the quill. I'm going to lead you through these things rather than that version of an omniscient narrator, where we see the narrator kind of stepping as far out of the frame as they can and pretending that this is all gospel truth. This is
Yeah.
a narrator who really wants to tell us about how they're working us.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think the first paragraph you don't really get any kind of I voice. We can come back to that first paragraph. But then in the second, he says,
Mm,
mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my knowledge. And you're like, what do you mean
mm,
I? Like, I think, again, we're
mm.
used to like the Victorian novel or the kind of realist novel as third person, right? This omniscient, like we're taught always like third person omniscient, right? And Dickens often plays with that. Sometimes there'll just be like an I will interrupt and you're like, wait, who is this I? Like, I thought the narrator was completely absent, right? And then you're like, is
Yeah.
it just Dickens himself talking to us? Is he putting on like a literary persona? Dickens as narrator as well as the narrator, right? You've got all these kind of interesting layers that I think
Hmm.
that mind exclamation mark, it's like suddenly he's talking to you, reader, directly.
Mm.
He's having a one-to-one with you. And that kind of, it's very voicey, like mind. I don't mean to say. It's tonally quite unexpected to me.
Yeah, and it is interesting, isn't it? That exhortation of the reader, that choice, mind. So pay attention,
Yeah.
but also in its other meaning, use your mind.
Yeah.
The thing that is going to be the whole power of A Christmas Carol that Dickens is also going to set up in this opening is imaginative work,
Mm,
our imaginative powers of projection. So it's quite interesting that it's that word, mind, exclamation mark, like pay attention, but also kind of get your mind in gear for the kind of mental gymnastics that are going to need to follow, because this is another version of the Victorian realist project, isn't it? That if we can empathize sufficiently with those we read about, our behavior towards them will change. Or if we're, say, the middle class reader, as many were, especially for Christmas Carolers, it was so lavishly bound and things,
mm,
it became quite expensive to buy. So the middle class reader that is then being attuned to the experiences of the very poor, the Cratchits, and then the figures of ignorance and want standing in for these figures that we need to mind, pay attention to. So I really like the way that it's that
mm.
word that Dickens uses to call us in.
Yeah. The call us in is a great phrase because, this Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. You have to trust in me, right? You have to
Yep.
trust in me as author, as narrator. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner, right? This listing, just to be like everyone agrees he was dead. I don't want you to think about this social world and ask questions. You have to get on board. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for everything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail, and some great alliteration there, and dead as a doornail. And
Satisfying, isn't it?
really
Um,
satisfying. But like the
yeah.
paragraph kind of just goes on, and you're like, okay, he's dead, we get it. But like he's like, no, I really need you to get this. And I think there's something like him extending for quite a few paragraphs about the deadness that I don't know in some of Dickens' other work. Like he's often accused of like melodrama and like the kind of like the really over the broad strokes of things, right? And this is really broad strokes, but at the same time, you're like, oh, this is actually quite dark and quite bleak, right? It's like the beginning of this Christmas story. It's called A Christmas Carol. We're beginning with death. We're beginning with foreboding. We're beginning with the Gothic. And I think there's a really interesting tension there that he's like setting up.
Yeah. And when you said about that alliteration, dead as a doornail, and then the soundings of you get what there is particularly dead about a doornail, as if that's a kind of pleasure on the tongue or in the ear as well as on the page, thinking about these as texts that were being read aloud. We know that Dickens was read in mechanics institutes, and that in families you'd have the copies of Dickens being circulated, so they'd be being read in the servants' halls as well as
Mm,
by the grand family. So that kind of audio quality of Dickens, but also the theatricality of this, that Dickens famously considered being an actor, and that you get a kind of oration here. It's almost like a verbal delivery, isn't it? Which Christmas Carol did go on to be a text that Dickens delivered in his public readings. It was like famously one of his favourites to deliver verbally. And you think, hearing you read that out loud and this kind of slow build, like insistence, setting this scene quite gradual to get across this key piece of information that you almost think that's the type of pace you'd need if you're hearing it, not just
Mm.
reading it, so that you don't miss this key thing.
Yeah, and that you saying that made me think of, the kind of epic poetry tradition, right, where people are reading aloud, and the reason that in the Odyssey and all these things that you've got these repetitions of like phrases, of like imagery, of symbolism, right? Like they always go back to the, the wine dark sea or whatever. That to hear something, to say it out loud, you need those little oral hooks, right? So I think even the kind of coming back to the deadness, the alliteration, the kind of the pacing, as you're saying, is helpful both for those people reading it aloud, but also those hearing it, right? You can imagine a family sitting around and like reading this together, and like the kids
Mm,
being drawn in to the scary bits, but also the adults kind of laughing at the, the irony in between the lines. So there is definitely
mhm,
something sound wise that's like quite fascinating. The wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. Like again, there's lots of like sibilants in there, and then the unhallowed hands, but all the country's done for, which then is like funny again, right? He goes swerves back and forth between like, let me tell you about the simile, whether it works or not. But if it doesn't work, like, we're all goners. It's kind of funny, right? The adults are kind of laughing at that. The kids are like, what is he talking about? Get back to the ghost, get back to the dead man.
yeah, the layers. Unhallowed hands is really interesting, isn't it? Given the way that Christmas Carol is interpreted as a kind of secular parable,
Mm.
although Dickens certainly talked about it as something that would inspire transformation in a Christian age. But in some ways, that the whole need for a Christmas Carol exposes the failings in Christian charity of the period. So, for the author or the narrator figure, this mysterious I voice, to say "my unhallowed hands," that feels really strange, doesn't it? That we've got an author who's declaring themselves as somehow, some way unholy to deal with the material.
Mm. Yeah, and even that, like that he's part of a larger social world, right? Or like all the country's done for. Like if I mess with this simile, like the literary
Mm,
tradition might fall apart, or what we understand to be like genre might fall apart. And I think there's something quite fun about that he's playing in that realm, because he's already famous by this point, right? When it comes out, his Oliver Twist has been out. Like there's quite a few, but like he's a known writer at this point. So there's a sense of him, I don't know, playing with his role as author and what like the literary tradition looks like, or the landscape looks like at this point anyway.
yeah, definitely. He's at an interesting point in his career because, as you say, he's quite well known and he's written some absolutely huge Victorian blockbusters by this point, with the early ones, Pickwick Papers, and Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, and he's just finishing off Martin Chuzzlewit as he's writing this. So he's sort of into his more established phase as an author, but at the same time, Dickens is nervous that his popularity could decline any minute. Like
Mm.
he's worried about going up like a rocket and coming down like a stick, and that somehow all of this accolade could disperse, and with it his income, that he's also worried that he's like reliant on writing for his money. And in part Christmas Carol, as well as being like this incredible social relational project, is also a commercial venture that
Yeah.
Dickens is hoping to like bump up his income from. So this idea about, yeah, the country's done for, this kind of talking about the authority of the author here, feels quite personal, I think,
Mm.
given that Dickens is at this point in his career where he still feels quite insecure,
Mm, that's
despite the
fascinating.
fact that he's very well known and an acclaimed author by now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because even that next line, you will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was dead as a doornail. Like, you will permit me. Like, again, this,
Mm,
he's like, you and me, reader, we're in this together now. Like, I've got you.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
in that next paragraph, Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were
Mm,
partners for I don't know how many years. So already we're like, wait, he kind of jumps ahead a little bit, being like, how could it be otherwise? Like, we don't know who Scrooge is, dear
mm,
narrator, but like there's already like an assumption that we're like in the world. But then he says they were partners for I don't know how many years, which obviously is like a turn of phrase, right? But for a narrator, we don't usually expect that. It's a very talky phrase, right? Something you might say between friends, like, oh, I don't know how long I've been working there. But it's like, well, why don't you know, narrator? Shouldn't you know that?
yeah, that is really fun of the phrase, isn't it? For being like, some things cannot be confirmed by this I voice. That
Mm,
we're not on absolutely solid ground here, because we've got a narrator who's going to tell us, well, pieces of this information are dark to me as well. Maybe that's part of the contract with the reader, that there's things that we'll discover together.
mm,
The narrator taking on that position of partial ignorance that mirrors that of the reader. But yeah, I think that's a great bit to pick out. Such an odd bit that you'd just skip over usually, unless you were doing this kind of detailed reading. But that really is glaring. I don't know how many years. Yeah. And then as it goes on, partners goes past quickly, doesn't it? But then you have this reiteration of Scrooge as the sole sort of connection to Marley, that there isn't anybody else to take on any of these roles of executor, administrator.
yeah,
It's all very legal language here: assign, residuary legatee, and then it goes to sole friend and sole mourner. That language of partnership, which just flickers into view, is then replaced by Scrooge being the only. So it doesn't feel, I guess there we're not sure, like, is Scrooge now as bereft, like left alone? Or is this telling us more about Marley? But then when we go on to learn that actually they're not really friends, he's not really mourned, it's even harsher, because this is telling us about a total breakdown in social connection. So, yeah, I think that's important, that the word partner gets replaced repeatedly by the word soul.
yeah. And that sentence really amps that up, right? His sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, just
Mm,
all joined by commas, right? He's just like, I'm just gonna list them, list them, list them, list them, and the more you repeat soul, the more that
mm.
aloneness is foregrounded. But like, you say soul enough, and then you hear like the other kind of soul, right? Like
Yeah, you're hearing the
you,
homonym there.
you know,
Yeah, without soul, like
yeah,
this lacking of heart and soul.
yeah, and soul mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event. You're like, okay, these real kind of like he's like yanking us round here. Like he's giving us lots of backstory, if you like. He's giving us exposition, but he's doing it so quickly in a way, right? He's like setting out a whole like tableau of these two men and what they meant to each other. All the while, we have to be like, oh wait, he's just told us one of them is dead, and now he's telling us the other one doesn't actually care that he's dead. You're like,
Yeah,
how is it
yeah,
a Christmas story, Dickens? Like, where are we going here? Where are you taking us?
yeah.
And then, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. That
Yes,
undoubted bargain, like you hear in undoubted, the narrator is suddenly offering maybe like a moral or at least like an ethical spin on that, right? Like up until now, he's been telling us something about both characters, and we're reading between the lines, but they're like
mm.
an undoubted bargain feels spiky.
Because we'll then go on to understand the kind of business that Scrooge is conducting, which feels perhaps even harsher than another kind of occupation on the day of your soul friend's funeral.
Yeah.
That perhaps if he were a doctor or somebody who assists others, going to work on that day would feel less jarring. But in fact, he's probably calling in bad debts or putting people like the Cratchits into further difficulty by refusing to give them extensions on their loans. So this kind of money work that he's doing on that day, that you might want to call sacred and not work on, given the importance of Marley in his life.
Mm.
But he disregards those human connections in favor of like just get on with business, conduct something that if for Scrooge it's an undoubted bargain, it's going to be harmful to the person he's conducting that business with.
Yeah. Yeah, like a real little stab here that would like for those readers, I guess, who know Dickens, like, okay, we're still maybe in that social realm of like what does interconnection mean? Who owes what to whom? Like
Yeah.
this is an ongoing theme for him, right? These social interconnections. And then the last paragraph that we've got here, the mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. Like, it's just so funny how he keeps emphasizing this. This must
Yeah.
be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. Nothing wonderful can come of it, which, as you said earlier, is like about imagination, right? It's about leaning into narrative, leaning into story, but also
That's
like
right.
nothing wonderful can come of the story. Like he wants something to happen. He wants impact, to use that word that we talked about earlier. There's
Mm.
something quite interesting about that.
Yeah, I think when I read this section, that sentence, this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate, is the whole hook of this first section, really, that he's preparing us as readers for our own transformative journey, that all of this groundwork and reiteration has been to bring us to the point where we might be willing to go into a realm of wonderment that could be able to work on ourselves as we'll see it work on Scrooge, that this term wonder and its kind of social political valence, what wonder can do. This is so much like Dickens's manifesto for the power of literature, isn't it? That readers haven't encountered him yet as the editor of his own journal, but he'll go on in 1850 when he sets up his journal, Household Words, to talk about how the purpose of literature is to bring people together. And in then the preface to Bleak House, famously, the romantic side of familiar things,
Mm,
that we won't all just be kind of grinding away in the minutiae of our daily work and its dullness, but we'll begin to see kind of the wonder all around us all the time. And that will somehow transform us internally, but also in our relationships. So here we get the word wonder, and other times Dickens uses the word fancy,
mm.
romance of familiar. This is getting close to those kind of later mission statements that he makes about what literature does.
Yeah. And even like the story I'm going to relate, he's full in narrator mode, right? Like I'm going to tell you the story, but it's almost like this opening is like we're not in the story yet. Like I'm about to tell you this thing, but like I have to lay this groundwork first. Like it's
Yeah.
ideological groundwork, but it's also like narrative groundwork. There are some things you have to get on board with, otherwise none of this is going to work. I can't actually work my magic on you if you don't come with me.
Yeah, and the magic is lots of things, isn't it? It is a joyful story to read that we're going to get gripped by. It's, although not immediately for Dickens, going to be quite a money spinner. It's the wonder is also something that can be commercialized.
Mm,
But I think to take Dickens at his word here, I do really believe that he also thinks something really powerful, transformative is going to happen. And you drew us back to him talking about the story. Like, I really like this moment in it about the power of storytelling, what a story could do in the world. And yeah, it feels like such a good message for Christmas, all times of year, but like a message that we might want and need right now as well. That if we can tell better stories
mm.
to one another, we might actually improve the way we live.
Yeah, again, one of the reasons why close reading is important, right? Like we're so used to just absorbing story on a daily level, whether it's, on social media or on the news or whatever, without pausing to be like, wait, what, why was the passive voice used there? Like what is
Yeah.
happening when that bit of language is used or that kind of word? What
Mm.
does that metaphor actually do for us when we're not interrogating it? And I think he's saying you got to pay attention to these words. Like these words are important. Like I know I use this simile and maybe it's not the best simile, but like we'll go with it because it's the one that everyone knows. Like, he's calling our attention to being active in reading, right? That it isn't just a passive state, which we might expect,
Yeah.
right? Just like picking up the realist book and just sinking into it. But actually, he's like, you need to do something too.
Yeah. Mind.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny that then he says, like, if we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there'd be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged gentleman rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. So you're like, he's like, this is really long digression of this kind of intertextual reference to Hamlet, but also
Yeah.
I don't know, that say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance. I think he's like, let's get back to London. Let's drag you back to like the milieu that you're used to with me, almost is what it feels like. But again, treating the play being like, even these canonical works, the works you might know, like they do require you to do something as a listener, as a viewer, as a reader. And I think he's placing himself in like a much bigger tradition of genre in a way, like in the broadest sense, like genre is the contract with the reader that these are the conventions, this is the boundary, if you like, that we're going to work in, and you have to be in it, otherwise it's just a man walking along his ramparts, and it therefore has no magic, has no meaning.
Yeah, and it's no accident there that the reference is to a play,
Mm-hmm.
that this is also going to be a kind of spectacle. And although maybe now we think of Shakespeare as perhaps less culturally accessible or sort of high culture,
Mm-hmm.
for Victorian theatre goers like them, that would be a much more accessible reference point than another novelist. He
Yeah.
doesn't cite Bulwer Lytton or Thackeray or Walter Scott.
Yeah.
One of his favourites, he could definitely give them a Scott reference here. But instead he
Mm.
goes for the theatre which people will likely know, and Hamlet, who will be a recognisable figure. This doesn't feel like an intertextuality that's there to demonstrate the author's
Right.
great learning, although sometimes I think Dickens invokes Shakespeare to show, yeah, look, I know my material. And also, let's think about me in a kind of lineage with
Yes.
Shakespeare. Let's place me in that company. But here I think he's going for it because he expects his readers to be able to use that reference, to visualize it, and then to kind of have a smile at thinking of themselves as like a middle-aged gentleman who goes for a stroll, and that's a little bit like Hamlet's father
Yeah.
stalking about. Yeah, it's a really nice sort of come with me again, rather than here's the clever thing you're not going to get.
Yeah, 100%. I think even just having this conversation, this isn't the thing that I think of when I think of A Christmas Carol, right? Like this setup is not the thing that immediately comes to mind. It's all the rest of it, and actually that we've had a whole page of him like digressing, turning around, setting
Mhm.
up, like doing all this like scene setting that I think is so funny. Just as you say, I said at the beginning, to like go back to the text and be like, where does it actually begin? What is it? Where is our grounding? And I always say
Mm.
this to students, like the first page of a book will tell you everything you need to know about the entire thing, right? Like if you read closely enough, that first page, it will telegraph everything you need to know. And here he's giving us lots about style and form and genre and narrative and author reader, about social relations, about like the tone. Like he's doing so much in what seems, I can imagine some readers being like, oh my god, this is boring. When do we get to know some stuff about the characters, right?
Mm.
It's a really fun and strange start to a book that I think people think they know.
Yeah, absolutely. That we're not really getting any insight. You would think you'd want a strong character hook
Yeah.
to take you into the story, that you'd be wanting to get to know Scrooge a bit quicker than this. And in fact, it's quite deferred, isn't it?
Mm,
We have to wait for quite a while before we hear anything more than Marley was dead.
yeah.
Yeah, it's a surprising opening, but then our conversation around what Dickens wants the work to do then does make this very understandable as the contract he needs to set up with
Mm,
the reader.
yeah. Which is an interesting way maybe into this question, but usually on this show, when I'm talking to the author of the text we're looking at, I kind of ask them about their
Yeah.
writing practice and how they came to that particular text. Do we know much about how Dickens was writing? Like, did he have a? I'm sure he was quite talkative about this, but I'm not actually sure. Like, do we know much about how he wrote? Like, what his setup was?
Yeah, well, for Christmas Carol in particular, he talks about emotional writing.
Hmm.
He talks about laughing and crying by turns as he writes this. So that I guess there he's also modeling what he hopes the reader will do, that will
Hmm.
have these strong reactions to the material. And he also is doing a thing that becomes very much a Dickens writing hallmark, that he talks about tramping the streets of London, often at night, thinking out the characters and laughing and weeping aloud as he walks the streets and formulates this story. So, yeah, he does give quite an extraordinary sort of tale about how he's writing this, but he's also pretty busy. He's squeezing this in alongside the commitment he's got to be producing the parts of Martin Chuzzlewit, which is still going along. And I should credit Michael Slater's amazing Dickens biography here, because Michael's book traces it's a biography of Dickens as the professional author, what he's writing alongside each other.
Mm.
And Michael Slater points out how Dickens is working up to Martin Chuzzlewit's sort of full transformation, reformation, that he's going to recognize that his former selfishness has been a harmful thing that has damaged those around him,
Hmm.
and have a change of heart, very like the one Dickens practices in A Christmas Carol. And then once this is done, he goes on to write that section of Martin Chuzzlewit. So he's kind of trying to draw the threads of this much longer piece together while writing this short fiction over just a couple of months before he's handing it in to the publisher,
Hmm.
ready for it to be out in December 1843.
So he's writing quite quickly then. This, if he's churning out in a couple of months, like it's very breezy.
Yeah, and Dickens isn't known for heavy edits.
Hmm.
Maybe the exception of Great Expectations, where he's labouring the ending and there's scoring through and he's changing the ending. Dickens' manuscripts are not heavily rethought,
Hmm.
that there'll be mild changes, but typically as he writes is what you get. And that's maybe a function of serialization, that he's writing often to weekly or more often monthly deadlines, but and having more than one project on the go. Christmas Carol's Dickens's first Christmas book, but then due to its great success and the fact that he sees a kind of both social and commercial function to it, he then has a habit of doing Christmas writings, which just have to fit in alongside all his other scheduled work. I always find it surprising as well that he's such a prolific letter writer,
Mm.
that the Dickens' surviving letters run to 12 volumes. And he's just writing all this correspondence every day as well. Later in his life, he'll go on to edit journals as well as write journalism for them. And I think he's writing some journalism through this period as well. So he works across genres and is sort of turning his hand to different kinds of writing within every day. Yeah, he works at pace.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I wonder whether about that drafting as well. I mean, I imagine it'd be interesting to be working on this massive like book in serial installments, right? Writing as you go, like
Mm.
tweaking the narrative, and then writing something like in its entirety that you know is going to be published in one piece, right? That isn't reliant on the cliffhanger, the all of these like narrative devices that he's used to using, right? Like the end of a section or kind of like leaving questions open that he's writing in kind of one piece. Whether yeah, I would love to know, like, to ask him like how satisfying that was in a way, maybe to just write something in its entirety and send it out, as opposed to this kind of ongoing long project, which I don't know, that would stress me the hell out, I think.
Yeah, and then to get an immediate
Yeah.
response to the finished thing rather than getting kind of the unfolding of how readers are reacting and watching the sales of his next novelized installment to think, oh, are people going along with this?
Yeah.
He had a kind of immediate outpouring of public love for A Christmas Carol. So that would have felt very different, I
Mm.
think, from the experience of having, along with his readers, this kind of long journey and wait for what everybody really thinks,
Mm.
that affirmation, oh, that they loved it, they love me. He often spoke about people's reaction to A Christmas Carol, and Thackeray's reaction in particular really meant a lot to Dickens, where Thackeray talked about it as like a national benefit.
Hmm.
So clearly Dickens was reading his reviews, and that would have been quite different to his typical way of publishing, and maybe is also a reason why this Christmas publication becomes a kind of habit for him, that he
Mm.
wants to do this again.
Yeah, and interesting that we don't talk about those other Christmas books as much, right? Like this is the one, like this is the one that people know. And even if you have read A Christmas Carol, like I wonder how many people have read the other ones that are, some of them are like really weird also and quite fun and strange. Like some of them also have other ghosts in them, right? He's repeating certain
Yeah,
motifs, and but really fascinating. Like this is the one that kind of like hooks the public imagination. I'm sure there are people who've read no other Dickens books, but like this one they might have. That is nice to kind of go back to.
definitely. That he is right in this opening section, that if we understand the premise, something wonderful is going to come of it. And I think there is a wonderment still in like the desire to retell this story, adapting it, remaking it. There's a book called by a critic called Paul Davies, The Carol as Culture Text,
Mm.
which uses the adaptations of the Christmas Carol over the 20th century to tell a story about 20th century culture, like how we need the Christmas Carol at different moments and how we reinvent it, reflect it for our own era. Um, yeah, amazing adaptations of it. And the way that that just doesn't seem to look like stopping fantastically, that people will still want to put on different versions of A Christmas Carol. And Dickens gave us a bit of a gift there, I think, as well, by also leaving the reading text of A Christmas Carol.
Mm.
Mentioned earlier that he went out and delivered it as part of his public reading tours, often using it for fundraisers as well, not only for his own commercial benefit, but also to raise money for things like Great Ormond Street.
Mm.
Um, so it has, and it still often is used like for charity events, isn't it? It has that kind of social responsibility element to it. But I was just thinking about an incredible performance of Christmas Carol I saw as a one-man show by Patrick Stewart,
Hmm.
which was partly based on Dickens's reading text, as well as adapting the novel, drawing those things together. And that was just incredible thing to witness, be part of. And I think my feeling for that is replicated for probably lots of people listening and thinking, oh yeah, I remember the Christmas Carol that I've really
Yeah,
loved.
for sure. And there's a new one. I keep seeing it on buses everywhere. It's called Christmas Karma, which
Oh,
is, and I think it's from the director of Bend It Like Beckham. But I read a review recently and it said it was terrible. But maybe it'll be good. I
oh,
don't know. But like again, just the need to keep returning to it. And
yeah,
if our conversation is anything, like readers, please go back to the text, go buy it, go find it, or it's free online in many, many forms. Go back to the original text and see whether you have a different response to it from all the film versions or the theater versions you know. I highly recommend it. You can read it really quickly. You'll fly through it. It's very pacey and engaging, and it's much quicker than like you imagine it to be, or what you imagine a Dickens book to be.
yeah, it's a real pleasure, I think, to be able to read it alongside the other versions that you know and that you might see over Christmas. That if you've got time to fit in a reading of it alongside seeing an adaptation, and then you get that joy of looking at the things that are being pulled out,
Yeah.
and a kind of, it sometimes feels a bit unfamiliar, doesn't it, when you go back to A Christmas Carol and all of its strangeness. Some of it's like actual social horror,
Yeah.
that where the kind of critique of Scrooge's attitude based on views about surplus population, the
Mhm.
kind of violence, that idea that some of the poor might as well die, that's really energetically exploded by A Christmas Carol. Like, how can that kind of thinking exist? But is that so far from some of our own thinking about like who counts as the fully human? Whose lives do we value enough? Are we saying actually some people,
Yep.
sadly in our culture today, some migrants, we'd rather allow them to shipwreck
Yep.
and not receive care? Like some of these debates about like who is in Dickens's language surplus population, some of those are still really live, and reading Christmas Carol now can point those up to us.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and a great place to stop that bit of the conversation. Go back and read the book. Basically, that's what we're saying. Just go read it right now. We always end this way, but do you have any book recommendations for us, Holly? Like, as a Dickens person, like you may want to recommend a Dickens book we've not read, maybe, but are there other things you want to tell us to read that people can quickly maybe put on a Christmas list if this comes out early enough?
Yeah, am I allowed to recommend some quite obscure
Yeah,
later Christmas fiction by Dickens?
or
That
as
he
obscure as
writes
you want to
some
be.
more Christmas books through the 1840s, but then later, when he's the editor of his own magazines, he starts having Christmas numbers of the magazines, typically in collaboration with other authors. They're nearly all multi-authored, and sometimes working with now quite famous names like Elizabeth Gaskell, Wilkie Collins. They're regular collaborators with Dickens on these Christmas numbers. And there's a run of them through the 1860s that I really love, because I'm interested in Dickens and adoptive family, Dickens and the family of choice,
Mm.
Dickens and parents who are spinsters and bachelors who just long to have a child. And Dickens goes back to this plot line repeatedly as kind of the good news story
Mm.
of his Christmas numbers for his journal all the year round through the 1860s. So the one I really want to recommend, I think it's 1862, is Somebody's Luggage.
Mm.
And it has lots of stories by different authors around the theme of the luggage left at an inn. And Dickens tells the story attached to the boots in the hall, and it's an incredible adoption story. And I'll leave that to listeners to go and hear. But basically, Dickens is still using the Christmas number, and we could say pretty much all of his stories, his fiction, in the same way to encourage interconnection, to think about how we could be transformed by our love for one another. So that's persisting in the 1860s. And yeah, Somebody's Luggage, I think 1862. That's my recommendation.
That's perfect. This is a great recommendation. Thank you so much. And I will try and find it online and link it for everyone in the notes. Holly, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. This was really fun.
Yeah, that was super fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a review and share with people you know. You can also follow the show and me on Instagram at Books Up Close and on YouTube. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form linked in the show notes. It's really helpful to us. You can get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.